Hello and welcome to what is now the award-winning Pension Confident podcast. We are so proud to tell you the series has just won 2 silver awards at the 13th Europe-wide Lovie Awards, including Best Podcast. A big thank you to the judges and, of course, everybody who voted for us. My name is Philippa Lamb. This time, we're looking at renting. Why has it become so expensive to rent a home in the UK? Since November 2021, rents have gone up every single month, and in the last year, they shot up to their highest level on record, with private rentals nationally costing nearly 12% more than a year ago on average. Now, some tenants are having to spend more than half their take-home pay on rent, and evictions are climbing. So how did we get here? What can you do if you're struggling to pay? And what needs to change to make our housing market fit for purpose?
Half is pretty normal now for people to be spending half of their take-home pay on rent.
Landlords have had these huge mortgage rises and they're passing those rents on to tenants.
Never withhold rent.
Okay.
There are other ways to tackle this.
Here to share their expertise on those crucial questions, we have 3 guests. Jenny Lamb is Policy Officer for UK housing charity Shelter. Welcome, Jenny.
Hi, thanks for having me.
From The Times, Deputy Property Editor David Byers. Hi, David.
Hello.
And back with us, broadcast queen Becky O'Connor, PensionBee's own Director of Public Affairs. Welcome, Becky.
Thanks, hi.
As usual, before we start, please do remember that anything discussed on this podcast should not be regarded as financial or legal advice. And when investing, your capital is at risk. Now, just to give us an idea of how rents have ramped up, I thought I would start by asking all of you, when you were first renting, can you remember what proportion of your monthly income you were spending on the rent, Becky?
Yes, I can. And if we're talking take-home, then
Yeah.
it was nearly a quarter of my take-home pay that I spent on my one room in a house share with 5 people.
Okay, well, I think mine was about a third. Jenny?
Mine was also about a third. So I was 19, had a telesales job, £6.55 an hour. I am one of those people who keeps everything. So I have all my pay slips, all my...
Do you really?
Everything.
From all that time?
From all that time ago. I don't know why, and luckily it managed to make itself useful. So that's going to feed my bad habit of keeping everything from now on. £500 a month was the rent. I was splitting it with one other person. And I was taking home around £900 a month. So
it was a lot even then.
Yeah.
A
it was
lot.
a lot. Yeah, it was a lot in 2010.
David?
Mine is slightly skewed by the fact that I started out at a local newspaper in Gloucester where I was earning £10,500 a year in 2001, which reflects my age. And I think my rent was probably upwards of 50%.
That high?
It's my own fault. I chose to live in Imperial Gardens, Cheltenham.
Okay, so you live somewhere posh.
Expensive flat, posh flat, crap wage. Excuse my language.
Well, you know.
So not really representative of anything in particular, but it wasn't pretty.
Okay, well, let's look closer at what is actually happening in the rental market right now. And, of course, how it's affecting all of us. David, tell us what has happened to rents nationally and regionally recently.
According to the latest Hamptons figures, the rental growth in the year to September in Great Britain is 11.7%, and there are great regional nuances in that. So in Britain, the average monthly rent for all properties is £1,300. That's nationally. In Greater London, where there's a great shortage of properties, that figure's about 15.7%. And in Outer London, which is considered to be Greater London, including some of the outer suburbs, that's 16.2% in 1 year. So those rental rises are incredibly large at the moment, year on year.
And as you say, there are huge disparities. Kind of average figures aren't actually that helpful, are they, across the piece? But we'll get into why we're seeing these rises in a moment. But Becky, before we do that, how much of their pay are people spending now on rent? Do we have a sense of that?
Half is pretty normal now for people to be spending half of their take-home pay on rent. We just gave examples of how much we spent initially, and a third is challenging to live on, and particularly if you're going through different life phases and you're still renting. So if you have children and you're still renting, then that becomes, even if you're spending half on rent, that becomes less tolerable because your costs will be going up. It's not just the scale, the proportion of someone's take-home pay that's going on rent, it's also the other things that are happening in their lives, the other demands on their income, and the cost of living crisis, of course. So there's pressure from everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, this is about tight supply. And I know we've got figures that say now an average of 25 people look at each rental property. And that was just 8 in 2019. So supply is tight, but why is supply tight, David?
The origins of the crunch go back perhaps 20 years, when first-time buyers increasingly struggled to afford to buy a home as prices accelerated away from them. So the number of private renters has gone up from 2 million in 2000 to up to 4.6 million in 2021 to 22.
So a huge increase.
According to the English Housing Survey. So that's the first big pressure, huge increase in the number of renters, and the ratio of renters to properties has ballooned. And what you've had is this. Obviously, about 10 years ago, there was a big influx of buy-to-let investors who are meeting some of that rental demand, but that has now fallen away for a couple of reasons, which I'm sure we'll get into later. But one of them is increased tax charges from 2016 onwards, when George Osborne introduced a growing number of tax restrictions on landlords in the hope that some of them would sell up to free up stock for first-time buyers.
And they did.
And some of them sold up. Quite a lot of them absorbed the charges, a lot of them put up rent, and many of the landlords' properties, I think it's fair to say, don't necessarily correlate with the sort of properties that first-time buyers are looking for. So George Osborne's maths didn't exactly work out. But more recently, and this is the cause for this massive recent increase, landlords have had these huge mortgage rises, and they're passing those rents on to tenants. Shortage of stock added to that means you've got this, in a nutshell, particularly in urban areas, a big increase in rents.
Okay, so way more people renting, all sorts of difficulties for landlords in affording their mortgages, if they have mortgages on their property, a whole array of problems. Jenny, we should talk about evictions. How are these evictions and, of course, the high rents we've been talking about affecting homelessness figures?
Homelessness is on the rise, and it has been for a while now. We have, at any one time, on the streets of England, there are about 3,000 people sleeping rough. But that's the absolute tip of the iceberg. Most homeless people are either hidden homeless, so they may not want to be on the streets, so they may spend their time or their nights on public transport in abandoned, disused buildings, somewhere out of sight.
But they still have nowhere to go.
Or they could be sofa surfing with friends and family, knowing full well that they're outstaying their welcome. Or they could be in temporary accommodation. There are now record numbers of people in temporary accommodation. There's 271,000 people living in temporary accommodation, and 130,000 of those are children.
But presumably, as you say, with hidden homeless, we don't really have any sense how many people are sofa surfing, do we? Or how many people are actually homeless?
Not a clue. There may even be people who are themselves homeless who don't really consider themselves to be so. You know, some people staying with friends who, this is a temporary arrangement while I get on my feet, well, I'll sort something out. But those people are technically homeless. They have no security in their homes. They can be asked to leave or whatever, you know, at a moment's notice. And they may end up on the street.
There's also one other quite interesting side issue, which is Ukrainian refugees. And many of them have coming to the end of their host family periods,
yes,
which lasted 6 months to a year. And I spoke to some recently who said, now the host family says, according to the government guidelines for our scheme, they don't have to look after us anymore. We've got to go into the rental sector. And the figures for how much it costs to rent a property are now so far beyond what Ukrainian newcomers can afford. I know this affects a small number of people, but for people entering the rental sector for the first time, it's a massive shock. You know?
It is, as you say, it's a small number of people, but it's indicative of how the system works.
And of course, what a lot of people have done, not just refugees, but all sorts of people, have moved away from where they were to lower rent areas, haven't they? Do we have any sort of picture on that?
There are quite a lot of pressures on the rental sector outside of the prime areas. So, I mean, London's a really good example of this. So, you know, there was some figures out recently from Spare Room, the flat share site, and they showed that in some areas, the price of renting a room in some London postcodes has risen by 50% in a year. And those areas are absolutely all over the place. So W8, which is a posh postcode, roughly speaking, has had this 45% increase. But less affluent postcodes, like SE28, have seen a 36% increase. And that's because a lot of people from affluent postcodes are going to more affordable postcodes and driving up the costs of rent in affordable postcodes as well. But if you go into tourist towns, a colleague of mine went to Frome in Somerset recently, then you have this whole other issue of race for space people who've moved out into the countryside, eaten up properties, driven up rent and housing prices in those areas.
I wanted to ask you, Becky, about this, because obviously we've had changes in working patterns too. So people don't have to go to the office or their workplace every day in the way that they used to. So that has freed up people, not just in the pandemic, but after, to live very remotely from where they're working. Is this another push for that as well? Because you can move somewhere cheaper, can't you, if you have to?
You can, but not everyone can. And I think although we saw people taking the opportunity to move further away from the office because they didn't need to be in it, we have also since seen some people having to move back because they have actually been asked to come back into the office and they weren't expecting it, and it's caused huge upheavals. So that is creating demand. I think I'm right in saying this, David, for those areas that are commutable.
Becky, I'm interested to kind of get into what this really means for all of our finances, because obviously it's not just about paying rent. It's about you don't have any spare money because you're paying so much rent, so you're not saving.
Yeah, so I think it's fair to say that because of rising rents and because of the rising cost of living more generally, people have been sort of thrown into survival mode with their finances,
Yeah.
which is exactly where you don't want to be if you're trying to build long-term financial resilience and do all the right things and prioritise your pension and, save for children's university costs and all those things that, us in the industry tell people to do all the time. It can't be on your radar.
There's no slack in your finances.
Absolutely. If all you're doing is the kind of week-to-week budgeting. So it is having an impact. We at PensionBee have seen that has counterintuitively caused an increase in contributions for some people because they are a lot more focused on where the opportunities are. But that,
It's the lucky few. Hi, it's me, Philippa, just interrupting briefly to remind you to click on that subscribe button so you never miss an episode of the Pension Confident podcast. Remember to share, rate and review too. And now I'll leave you to enjoy the rest of this month's conversation. Happy listening. Jenny, I think, mentioned older renters. And I'm interested in that because we're seeing a lot more older people renting now than we have done before, aren't we? And if you're already retired and renting, you're coping with this rising rent. You might be on a fixed income. That's a big problem, I'm guessing.
The idea of a renter is completely changed. It used to be we saw people leaving university, going into flat shares with their friends, building up their deposits, having a bit of fun along the way, then buying a house, doing all the things in the right order, having kids, You've got your mortgage. It's a 25-year mortgage. You can manage it. So lovely. And of course, that doesn't happen in the same way anymore. So what we see is that people miss that opportunity to buy a home for themselves because they just can't afford it. And that moment where they could buy disappears into the past and they just deal with okay, I'm renting now. It then makes it very difficult for somebody to be able to build their pension while they're paying the rent, which is rising. And then they reach retirement or the retirement years and they don't have a big enough pension, but they still have the housing costs from the rent. What this is doing is they're having to work for longer. So that retirement becomes something that just isn't going to happen because the only way you can afford your rent and you can afford to stay in that home is to keep working.
Yes, indeed.
There's some good figures on this, actually, from the English Housing Survey analysis by Hamptons. I remembered from back in July. So they think that 11.5% of all retirement-age couples will be in the private rental sector by 2033, and that's compared to 5.7% last year. So that's
pretty well doubled.
So that's a rise from 400,000 roughly to about 1 million. One of the things that is interesting about this is there's always this inheritance issue. If somebody dies and has a property, they pass on the value of that property to somebody. If more and more and more older people are being swept into the rental sector in retirement, inheritance will not be passed down.
Yeah.
And so there's all sorts of interesting, fairly profound intergenerational ramifications of that.
This, I think what we are understanding from this conversation is this is a structural problem, isn't it, on many levels? And of course it affects landlords, doesn't it? Because a lot of them have looked on their properties as alternatives or side by side with their pension funds.
That is a key reason why people have invested in buy-to-let over the years. They've felt that property has been more tangible and more secure than pensions, which have, as an industry, had its fair share of scandals over the years that have put people off. And people have looked at property as, we can touch this, we can feel this, we're more in control of this than a pension fund, so we'll go there. That equation now doesn't necessarily stack up for all the reasons David was mentioning earlier. What that does mean is that there are an awful lot of people who are owning rental property and they will need to realise that investment, and that means selling it. So that means potentially evicting tenants.
What I would want landlords to understand is this is a serious job. It's a very, very serious job because this might be your property, but it's somebody else's home. And so many children now are living in the private rented sector. And we know how important a secure home is. So you're kind of indirectly taking on a burden of responsibility for someone's entire future, for their prospects, for their mental health, for their physical health. To be a good landlord is a hard job. And it kind of should be, because these are people's lives.
That's a really interesting take on it. And actually, it brings me really neatly to the next thing I wanted to ask you, which is your rights as a tenant and as a landlord. I mean, the first question in my mind is, can you challenge a rent increase if your landlord says, I want to put your rent up?
The first thing that I'd like to get the message out there is everyone is shocked to find that there is no limit to the amount a landlord can put the rent up. There is no limit. You can challenge it. The increase should be guided by market rent. If you think that your rent increase is disproportionate, if it's above what you think a similar property in your area would be going for on average, then you can go to the first tier tribunal to challenge it.
Does that cost you?
It doesn't, but there is a risk involved. First of all, that your rent could go up instead of down. If you've miscalculated, if you've had a look at local rents in your area, you've got it wrong, and the tribunal decides, oh, actually,
it could
the
even
landlord
be higher.
could be asking for more,
right?
Then your rent will go up instead. Okay. The second barrier, I think, is it's just a massively stressful thing to do. People work, people have kids, people aren't really expecting to have to challenge their landlord in a tribunal to stay in their home.
Thinking about tenants, if your property, as you say, landlords, some perfectly well-intentioned landlords are struggling for finances, particularly if they're retired, they may be on fixed incomes, these are not all profiteering bad people. But if your property that you're paying a lot of rent for is not being repaired, can you withhold rent?
Never withhold rent.
Okay.
This is one of my biggest messages. I wish everybody knew this. It seems completely counterintuitive, because you think, essentially, I'm a customer paying for a service that I'm not receiving. I wouldn't be paying for a bad service,
a leaking flat or whatever it is.
In any other walk of life, in any other kind of business arrangement, you wouldn't be paying for a poor service. But it's not the same in the rental market. It's not a bargaining chip. If you withhold your rent, the landlord will may take steps to evict you. With a Section 21 notice, you can also add on a money judgment, so they can pursue you for the lack of income, and then you're essentially left with nowhere to go. So although it seems fair and proportionate to withhold your rent, it always makes things worse. There are other ways to tackle this. There are other ways to challenge a landlord about poor conditions. The first thing I would recommend is always just approach them civilly. Don't assume they're not going to do anything. Speak to them on a one-to-one basis and just explain the situation, ask for them to do the repairs. If they don't, you can make a complaint to your local council. They should send an environmental health officer out who should inspect the property.
So I'm just going to ask you, before we move on, if you are struggling to pay your rent, where can you go? Is there any assistance for you?
If you're struggling to pay your rent, there are a number of things that I would recommend you do, first of all. So the first thing I would say is talk to your landlord. It's scary. None of us want to do it. But explain your circumstances. Explain what would be affordable if they're wanting to put the rent up, for example. Explain what's affordable for you. See if you can negotiate with them. See if they might drop the rent for if you're between jobs. If you're expecting your circumstances to change, explain that to them. See if you can negotiate a lower rate and then put back up at some point. The second thing I would say is make paying your rent your priority. We talk a lot about the different, people having to make completely inhumane decisions between heating and eating.
Yeah.
But it's heating, eating and paying the rent. And there are certain debts that are a priority. So prioritise paying your rent. And then you might want to look into other ways that you can subsidise your income. If you're on benefits, check your benefit entitlement, because it could be that you are entitled to something that's not loudly advertised that you qualify for.
Yes, because a lot of benefits still go unclaimed, don't they?
Absolutely. So check that. Make sure that's all squared away. You can also speak to your energy providers. Sometimes citizens' advice can be really helpful in telling you where you can save on other bills. You might be eligible for council tax relief or at least a bit of help there, or with your gas and electric, telly, broadband, that kind of thing. There are also grants, charitable grants that you might have a bit available to you.
How would you find them?
If you go to a brilliant charities website called Turn to Us, there is a grant search, It asks you a few questions about your circumstances and it tells you what you might be eligible for.
Great.
So they also have a benefits checker calculator as well. So put your circumstances in there. They might be able to tell you if you're owed more. If you're working, there may be an industry-affiliated charity, like catering or bar work or something like that.
Hardship funds, that sort of thing.
Funds.
Yeah.
And then you can always ask your local council. There's discretionary housing payments are available, although decreasingly they are shrinking, they are disappearing.
And these are one-off payments to tide you over?
A discretionary housing payment's a one-off payment to basically avoid homelessness. That's in a nutshell. Speak to your landlord. Come up, make yourself a household budget. Try and see where you can. I'm not advocating that people cut their costs elsewhere because people are cut to the bone, but just be mindful that there could be something cheaper, there could be some help.
That's really helpful, Jenny. Thank you. We all understand, if we didn't understand at the beginning of this podcast, that, we need to see some change to make the rental market work better for everyone here. So shall we move on to that? We've got the Renters Reform Bill, haven't we?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
The Renters Reform Bill was a manifesto promise of the Conservative Party, an election, a promise upon which they were elected.
We still don't have it, do we?
We have been talking about this since before I have been working at Shelter, but very recently we have just had its second reading. Now, the Renters Reform Bill, it's a raft of different kind of policy measures, but the main one is the abolition of Section 21 notices.
Which I'm assuming Shelter would welcome.
We would welcome that. Yes, we would be very pleased to see that happen. It doesn't mean that landlords won't be able to evict tenants. There is another type of notice that can be used. It's called a Section 8 notice. And really, the main difference between the two notices is with Section 8, you have to give a reason. And there's a list of kind of preset reasons that you can give.
So it'll do away with Section 21s. Mm-hmm. And it does away with fixed-term assured tenancies as well.
It does. It's sort of almost a strange byproduct of getting rid of Section 21 is that everyone will be in a periodic arrangement, a periodic rolling tenancy.
And what does that mean?
Now, when you enter into a tenancy agreement, you have a fixed term for normally a year. Then when that year is finished, automatically your tenancy turns into a periodic one where you roll over month by month. You're not tied in for another fixed term. Some landlords will represent it as though, your tenancy is coming to an end. You must re-sign for a new fixed term. That's not what the law says.
Okay.
Some people like that added security. It doesn't suit everybody. It doesn't suit someone in really dire conditions with black mold on the wall and their kids are sick and they want to get out. They can't be trapped in a fixed term. So a periodic arrangement gives them more freedom to move if they need to. The other kind of byproduct of this is during a fixed term, you can't put the rent up. In a periodic arrangement, you can put the rent up using a particular type of notice, a Section 13 notice, and that mechanism is limited to once a year. So abolishing Section 21 means the end of fixed terms, means the standardisation of periodic tenancies, and it also means that rents can only go up once a year. So it has a kind of knock-on effect that we're hoping might do some work in slowing rent increases. And because a landlord won't be able to evict a tenant just for refusing to pay a rent increase, then hopefully it has a slowing effect on how rapidly rents are rising.
It's sounding like a step in the right direction when it finally comes into law. David, what about affordable housing? We hear a lot about that, don't we? But there is nowhere near enough affordable housing being built, is there?
There isn't. And actually, I just wanted to add something to that excellent analysis by Jenny. I think the one thing that we really lack, and this is something that Jenny was always talking about, is there's no competition for this appalling system at the moment, whereby landlords are responsible for the well-being and future of tenants. And so what I'd like to see is a growing subsidy scheme for build to rent. These are basically institutional rental, purpose-built rental buildings without landlords. And you'll see them at the moment. They are all over London and major cities. Builders like Uncle, builders like Greystar, Quintain, which own the whole of the Wembley estate. And there's one up the road from where we're recording here.
King's Cross,
in King's Cross, Argent. And the problem with these buildings is that, yes, they don't have landlords, so there's much greater security for the tenants, which is a good thing. So tenants will always be able to stay in their properties. But the problem is, because land is so expensive in cities, these institutional builders can only build if they build small properties and they charge high levels of rent. So if there was a subsidy scheme, some sort of government scheme, which encouraged, which subsidised and helped these institutional builders, encourage them into the market, you'd get all of these big institutional developers building purpose-built rental properties. They'd be able to charge reasonable rents for them. They'd be able to build properties suitable for families.
Yes, a wider range of properties.
Because at the moment they're suitable for young professionals and urban dwellers, not suitable for families. So I think competition is a good thing. If landlords had competition, if these developers were encouraged and incentivised to build more properties, landlords would be forced to up their game. If you're a landlord, you want tenants in your property. And if the tenants are all going to that Quintain developer down the road, you're going to work harder. You're going to charge more reasonable rent. You're going to remove the mould from the wall. But there's no competition, so the sector's totally broken.
Bringing it back to pensions, just because everything can be brought back to pensions. The kind of institutions that David is mentioning, actually, they can be pension fund managers. And in fact, Legal in General, which is a very big pension provider, does offer the kind of private rented accommodation that we're talking about. But for all the reasons David said, on a scale that's just too small at the moment to kind of change the culture around renting. But it can be a pension fund investment that then supports the retirement of people through the rental income that is coming back into the fund and going back to the pension savers.
In the same way that they invest in commercial property.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it can be a very beautiful circle, but it would require that subsidy to kickstart the market.
For us at Shelter, social housing is the way. Affordable rents, I mean, fine, but they can be up to 80% of market rent. They're still not affordable for people who need things to be affordable. Social housing, we believe, where there is more support for people, more security, that we think is more of a solution.
On that thought, I am going to wrap this up, and I'm sorry because I know there is so much more that we could talk about. But thank you very much, everyone. All sorts of useful things to hear there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Once more, before we go, please do remember that anything discussed on the podcast shouldn't be regarded as financial advice or legal advice, and when investing your capital is at risk. Next month, we're going to be talking about financial mistakes and how to avoid them. Don't miss it, because our expert guests will be sharing their own financial blunders. In the meantime, you can check out our podcast feed right now for plenty of bonus content, and we would love it if you'd leave us a review. If you listen on Spotify, there is a new way to do that. Just tell us your thoughts in the box right below the episode description. It is as simple as that. Thanks for listening. See you next time.